and get us on the road.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's really an honor to be here and an honor to be in this company, needless to say. I'm going to talk to you tonight about the relationship, as I see it, between science and human values. And this is the subject of my current book, The Moral Landscape. Now, many people think this relationship is somehow problematic, usually because they think that the universe is parceled into these separate quantities. On the one hand, we have facts, which obviously science can deal with. But on the other, we have values, which inconveniently for us cover the most important questions in human life. And it's thought science really can't touch these. Questions of right and wrong and good and evil, questions about really the core issues of how to raise our children, what proper goals we should strive for in life. And it's thought that while science may be able to help us get what we value, it can never tell us what we ought to value. And I want to push this intuition around because I think this is an illusion. I think the split between facts and values is an illusion. And I think it's quite a dangerous one to be taken in by at this moment in human history because we're in danger of waking up in a world where the only people who are absolutely sure that moral truth exists will be religious demagogues who think the universe is 6,000 years old. And they'll be sure that these truths exist because they got them from a voice in a whirlwind. So I actually think the connection between facts and values is actually quite straightforward and philosophically uninteresting. And for that reason, we could ignore much of what has been said in moral philosophy over the ages. I think values reduce to facts. They reduce to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. And if you just imagine a universe where there are only rocks, clearly there are no values in this universe. There's nothing that can care about change in the universe. The moment you get conscious minds that can experience change, then we can talk about changes that matter. We can talk about right and wrong and good and evil. We can talk about this because what there is to value are changes in experience, to the degree that experience can change. So if we care more about our fellow primates than we do about insects, as indeed we do, it's because we believe they're laid bare to a wider spectrum of changes in experience. And I think we're right to feel that way. We're right to have our moral intuitions track the possibilities of experience. And if you doubt this, I would just ask you to consider, imagine a universe in which every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Okay, I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. Now, if the word bad means anything, it applies to that situation. Now, if you think that the worst possible misery for everyone might not be bad, or it might be good in the end, or there might be something worse, I don't know what you're talking about. And what's more, I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're talking about either. Now, this, it seems to me, is the only philosophical assumption you have to grant me. The worst possible misery for everyone is bad, and everything else, every other possible state of the universe, is better. And given that the experience of conscious minds is a natural phenomenon emerging out of the way the universe is, and is constrained by the laws of nature in some way, then there are going to be right and wrong ways to move along this continuum of possible experience. There are going to be right answers to the question of how to avoid the worst possible misery. And it'll be possible to be wrong in your efforts to avoid the worst possible misery. And that's all we need for a science of morality. Now, some of you may be concerned that this notion of the well-being of conscious creatures is not well defined enough. And I get a lot of mail along these lines. I get people write me emails saying, well, you're saying that well-being is a value, but you haven't proven that it's a value. And I get emails like, who's to say that if you wanted to torture every conscious being to the point of madness, that's not as good as any other strategy? How could you prove that? Think by analogy of physical health. Okay, physical health as a concept is very loosely defined. It's a truly elastic concept which changes as we make breakthroughs in medicine. When the statue was carved, life expectancy was 25 or 30. It's now 80. If we ever re-engineer our genomes in such a way as to live to be 1,000, our expectations of health would change markedly, and yet we can have a science of medicine without tying down the definition of health. And what you don't get, you don't get pushback, skeptical challenges to the philosophical foundations of medicine. You don't get people saying, well, who are you to say that health has something to do with living a long life free of pain and debilitating illness? You don't get someone saying, well, how would you convince someone with terminal smallpox that he's not as healthy as you are? And yet I get precisely this challenge. And my link between morality and well-being and my description of a possible science of well-being seems open to the challenge, well, how would you convince a member of the Taliban that throwing battery acid in the face of a little girl isn't good? We don't have to convince a member of the Taliban of that. We can't convince a majority of the American population that evolution is a fact, and yet biology thrives. Scientific truth is not predicated on convincing everyone. Now, this is true even of the least value-laden claims about the nature of reality. Think about water. For 150 years, we've known that water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. What do we do when someone doubts that claim? When someone comes into the room and says, well, that's not how I choose to think about water. Okay. Imagine a biblical chemist who comes in and says, well, chemistry for me is whatever fits the book of Genesis. Okay. Well, all we can do in that case is appeal to scientific values. The most basic scientific fact relies on the value of understanding the universe, the value of respect for evidence. I mean, what evidence could we put forward? If someone doesn't respect evidence, what evidence could we put forward proving that they should? If someone doesn't respect logical consistency, what logical argument can we put forward? And so too with parsimony and intellectual honesty and mathematical elegance in other areas of science. I mean, these are values. Science is in the values business. So the most basic facts about the nature of reality can't be asserted without a tacit appeal to value. So the valuing, avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone doesn't seem like a leap. And clearly there's a continuum of facts that relate most directly to human well-being, about which we can form true or false beliefs. And there's something to be understood about how we can escape a failed state, for instance, as Somalia is and was. This photo is from the 80s. But I mean, think of Congo at this moment, where everyone's daily concern is avoiding being raped and killed by drug-addled soldiers. There's something to be understood about how societies fail, about how people fail to collaborate. And movement on that continuum is non-random toward a place very much like the one in which we're living at the moment. And the requisites of human well-being can clearly be understood on many levels. We're talking about the genome, we're talking about states of the human brain, and we're also talking about economic systems and political arrangements. But each of these levels, granted the details are complex, each falls into one of the familiar bins of science. We're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics. This captures our possible discussion about the real causes of human and animal well-being. And so what I would ask you to consider is a moral landscape where the peaks correspond to the heights of human well-being, to speak of our case, and the valleys correspond to the lowest depths of misery. And one thing to notice is that there may in fact be many peaks on this landscape. There may be many equivalent but dissimilar ways to thrive. But there will be many more ways not to be on a peak. I mean, clearly there can still be right and wrong answers about how to move in this space. And when you admit this, you have to admit that some people are wrong about how we should live in this world, which is to say, some people care about the wrong things. They care about things that reliably lead to needless human misery. And it is not unscientific to say that. In fact, to withhold that judgment from the point of view of science is tantamount to saying we know nothing about human well-being and we will never know anything about it. And that, I think, is, at this moment in history, an intellectually dishonest thing to do, and I think it's actually a failure of compassion given all of the unnecessary misery in the world. Thank you very much.
So resulted from them.
I think that's actually a source of confusion. I totally agree with you, but we're using science in very different senses in this conversation.
I think you're right.
There's a lot of confusion about certainly what I mean by science. I did not mean for a moment to defend science in the very narrow sense as experimental science, men in white lab coats scanning brains as the only source of morality. And that's really a straw man. I mean science in a much broader sense, the sort that Steve invoked, of secular rationality and honest truth claims based on honest observation and honest and clear reasoning. And we all are citizen scientists in many of our, or honorary scientists in many of our moments. And insofar as we're intellectually honest and trying to have our beliefs about the world and our certainty about those beliefs kind of scale with the evidence. And that is the source of clear thinking about the possibilities of human and animal well-being. The crucial thing I want to argue for is that what do we mean when we say that something can be morally good or evil? And is that a truth claim, or is that just merely manufactured based on cultural invention or something that's been drummed into us by evolution and is just a product of our social emotions and emotions like disgust? There are two very different ideas about how science can lead us to strong truth claims about the nature of good and evil. One, somewhat advocated by Peter here, is that science is limited in describing kind of how we got here. So we have evolutionary science, which tells a story about how we got here, and we can understand what people do and mean in the name of morality in those terms. But it can never make the leap to tell us what we should do. And I think that there's confusion there, because it's one thing to ask, how is it that people basically every culture we've ever encountered has come to feel that women are in some sense the property of men? We can tell an evolutionary story about why that's so. We can tell a neurobiological story about what men are doing with their brains when they think that. But we can, in the spirit of science, we can ask a very different question. It's a totally different project, and we can ask, to what degree do people and societies become better? Which is to say, to what degree do they experience greater depths of well-being when they cease to treat women that way? And the answers there, whether or not any of us know them, are answers that fall within our growing scientific understanding of the human mind and all of the ways in which we can see the influences upon it. And again, that is not just laboratory science. That's from genetics to economics. And still, that's a domain of right and wrong answers, and it is not tied to evolution in any narrow sense. We have flown the perch of evolution, and most of what we care about, evolution cannot see and has never seen. Evolution has not designed us to build a stable global civilization, and yet clearly our future happiness is largely predicated on that.
Can I ask you? Can I ask you a question, Sam? Because we've had some discussion during the break, and maybe I did take your view of science too narrowly, in which case I apologize. But you just said you want this broader view of science from genetics to economics. Now, I know that if in other cultures, for example, if you think of the German term Wissenschaft, which we often translate as science, it includes philosophy and ethics, any serious study of a phenomenon. So I wondered why, if you would say not just from genetics to economics, but from genetics to philosophy.
Absolutely. I think philosophy, there is no clear border between philosophy and science. What I meant to denigrate in my opening remarks are some of the arguments in philosophy that I think are truly useless, and the conceptual distinctions that I think are leading us to miss the very obvious point that there's a difference between the worst possible misery and the greatest possible happiness, whatever that is, and even if there are multiple forms of it. And those differences are fully constrained by the laws of nature. So there have to be right answers, and the right answers are not predicated on whether we can find them. And we do science in the context of that larger reality which we may fail to fully discover. In fact, we know we will fail to fully discover it, and yet this includes every possible claim we can make in the moral sphere. And the idea in philosophy currently is that is an incredibly edgy and controversial thesis in moral philosophy and metaethics, and I frankly just don't see how it could be, given that every possible experience is only possible based on the nature of the way the universe is. And in principle, you could be mistaken. You could misremember your holiday. You could fail to know what it was actually like to be you on that holiday. And you could come away thinking, well, I love Hawaii, it's my favorite place. And your wife could rightly say, you were miserable every moment I sat next to you on the beach. and that's just, I mean, we are not incorrigible with respect to even our own experience of the world. Right. And we can be self-deceived, etc. Right. But and there's obviously distinctions that don't matter all that much, and it's not worth it to try to get the details right. But in the limit, it's very clear that we are operating in a space of possible experience that's constrained by the way the world is and the brains we currently have. And the idea that somehow we have to maintain this holding pattern of moral relativism or multiculturalism or just you all have to make it up for yourselves approach to questions, to the most important questions in human life is not intellectually honest. We don't all have to make up medical truth for ourselves. We don't all have to make up physics for ourselves, and we don't all have to make up what is actually true of the human mind for ourselves. And it's just not a. But it's not a credible.
I wasn't arguing that anything's made up, that we make up anything for ourselves.
Well, you work it out for everyone working it out for themselves could be wrong. There's a background truth, and that's all I'm arguing.
Do we think that the neuroscience, rapidly developing as it is, has any will it have any power in helping us understand some of these things? I mean, you talk about flourishing, Sam, human flourishing. Can you think of any neuroscience result that speaks to increases in human flourishing?
Well, I mean, that science is truly in its infancy, so it's not.
There were a couple of questions about what does the insula do, what do mirror neurons do. That's why I'm in neuroscience at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we're beginning to. I mean, people are beginning to study well-being at the level of the brain, but people are. There really is this taboo in science, and it's a taboo you can sort of hear reinforced in this room that. It is considered somehow intellectually disreputable or Orwellian or Huxleyan to ever imagine that science can tell us, in a prescriptive sense, how we should live. But there's nothing Orwellian about science telling you, medical science saying, listen, if you don't want to die of lung cancer, don't smoke. You know, there's no men in white lab coats don't descend on every smoker, and we just give the information out. And if you don't want to get lung cancer, well, the first thing to not do is smoke. There's no one in this room who would be indifferent to knowledge coming from science if we discovered how best to teach children compassion. I mean, surely there are wrong ways to teach children compassion. If an advanced psychology told us, listen, if you do this in the first 2 years of life, you're going to have much more compassionate children than they otherwise would be. Having some scientific understanding of the role that compassion plays in our life, who would be indifferent to that information? Who would feel that it was an Orwellian overreach on the part of psychological science to give that information out? I don't see the problem.
You can't derive an ought from an is. We've heard it lots of times. Could we just dispense with that quite quickly and somebody answer that?
Yeah, I would love to address that.
Can I?
Sure.
No, I think there's several.
I thought I dealt with that in my talk. We can't get is without ought. I mean, science can't justify science. That doesn't make science unscientific. I mean, science can't justify our urge to understand the universe. It can't justify our respect for evidence. It can't justify our respect for logical consistency. That doesn't make it unscientific. Medicine can't justify not wanting to die early. but once you admit you don't want to die early, you can have a science of medicine. These are false problems in philosophy, and that's one of the reasons why I started denigrating philosophy, because it's just, I mean, people are, you can't believe the email I get from very smart and overeducated people who think that that there's no way to argue against the Taliban because they've read some Hume saying you can't get an ought from an is.
Secondly, you said, I'm convinced that every appearance of terms like metaethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, anti-realism, emotivism, etc., directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe.
I stand by that.
Yeah.
So,
But you see, that's your view, Sam. I mean, I find it really exciting when people
I
talk
could be
about
wrong.
meta-ethics.
I could be wrong, but
Well,
it's my
it seems
view.
to me that
Share those value premises that you mentioned, but obviously not everybody does.
But
and I don't
Peter,
know.
why can't you do the same thing? Why can't you attack the philosophical underpinnings of medicine in the same way? If you're continually vomiting, you should go to the doctor and get X, Y, and Z. But that just assumes you don't want to continually vomit.
Yeah, it does, exactly.
What about the person who wants to continually vomit?
But that's an assumption. I mean, your example was, if I want to live longer, then I should do it. But not everybody does want to live longer.
But
right?
that's shorthand
That's-
for a whole suite of concerns that everyone recognizes are the only intelligible discussion about human health. And now if we can find one person who says, listen, I like vomiting, I like continuous pain, and I'd like to die tomorrow, he's not offering an alternate medical, health-based worldview that we have to take seriously. He just doesn't get invited back to the conference about medicine.
But
So it could be with the conference on morality. That's all.
But look, I do spend time at conferences where we discuss the technological imperative, the fact that you now have more equipment that can prolong people's lives. Should you use it? I mean, that's an ethical question that medicine doesn't really help you to answer.
No, okay, but that's a false use of my analogy. I'm not saying medicine can answer these things. I'm saying that question of whether we should use medicine in this way is intelligible in a larger space where we talk about human well-being. And
It's intelligible, but it's not answered.
well, no, it's hard. It could be hard to answer. There are an infinite number of scientifically coherent questions that we will never answer and we can't answer. My favorite, which I use all the time now, is what was JFK thinking the moment he got shot? Okay, we have no idea. But this is a well-posed question. It has an answer, and we don't know it. But we know what it wasn't. I mean, he wasn't thinking about string theory. He wasn't thinking.
you don't know that.
Yeah, I know that, and I'll tell you what I do know. He wasn't thinking, I wonder if Sam Harris is going to use me as an example at this conference.
Yeah.
I believe you can know as much science as you could ever find out, and you'll still not find the argument that will stop them in their tracks when they come to take you away. That's the point about the is-ought gap, and that's the point about not being able to derive morals from reason.
But that's a move you can't make in any other domain of knowledge. We have not found the argument that will convince a majority of the American people that evolution is a fact. Okay, 25% agree that evolution is a fact. It's been 150 years. Biology, the truth of biology is not predicated on being able to convince everyone. And so that's just it's just a